I'm Tom, coming to you from the International Institute for the Advancement of Sourdough Science and Research of Cleveland, Ohio, also known as my kitchen. Thank you for selecting this video. In today's video, I'm going to teach you one of the skills that is the most difficult for beginning sourdough bakers to develop, and that is the ability to read your sourdough crumb. What I mean by this is, you know what happens when you bake a loaf, it comes out of the oven, it looks perfect, then you cut it open, you look at the inside, and the crumb doesn't quite look like the pictures that you've seen in the videos or the pictures that people are posting on Instagram. And you can't tell if it's overproofed or underproofed, so you don't know how to correct your process to improve your crumb the next time around. So what we're going to do today is look at a number of pictures of loaves, and I'll tell you the techniques that I use to determine if my loaves are underproofed or overproofed by looking at the crumb. Now, there are a lot of factors that influence the crumb of a sourdough loaf. The type of flour that you use, the hydration level of the recipe, the gluten development, the handling during bulk fermentation, the bulk fermentation time and temperature, the way you do pre-shaping, the way you do final shaping, the way you do your final proofing, and even the way that you score and bake your loaf in the oven. All of these can impact the crumb. So how can you determine by looking at the crumb what the impact is? In my experience, 80% of the outcome of the final loaf happens in bulk fermentation. That is really what sets up the crumb of a sourdough loaf. Everything else will cause minor deviations around the edges, but if you're really focused on reading your crumb with respect to bulk fermentation, that easily gets you 80% of the way there, sometimes more. In addition to that, what I've done is I've baked hundreds of loaves over the last 2 years, and I've taken photos or videos of all these loaves. I've documented all the details of every one of these bakes so I know exactly what happened with each loaf, and I've followed the same recipe every time, the tartine bread basic country loaf recipe, so I've eliminated many of these variables. So what I'm going to show you today is photos of a number of loaves that I've baked, all using the same recipe, and really give you an indication of how the proofing level, that is the bulk fermentation and the final proofing of the loaf, impacts the crumb. So now let's briefly talk about what happens in the fermentation process, and I'm going to focus primarily on bulk fermentation because that's really where you introduce the most variability in the crumb. So in the bulk fermentation process, you basically have your starter mixed with your flour, water, and salt. In your starter, there are two things in here, two microbes, yeast and lactic acid bacteria. The yeast basically eats starches and sugars, it creates carbon dioxide, and that rises the loaf during the fermentation process. The second thing that's in here is the lactic acid bacteria, and that creates acid during the fermentation process, which kind of acts in the background for most of the fermentation process, but as you get on the back half of the process, the acid level starts to build up in the loaf, and that stimulates something called the protease enzyme. The protease enzyme eats gluten. So when you cross over that perfect point in bulk fermentation, and now the loaf starts to become acidic, the lactic acid bacteria is actually deteriorating your loaf, while the yeast is still trying to rise it. And that's why your loaves will flatten out during overproofing, is because the gluten is starting to get broken down by the protease enzyme. It's essentially like it's melting the loaf while the yeast is still trying to rise the loaf. That's what causes overproofing. Underproofing is very simple. You just haven't given the dough enough time and temperature. It's that combination of those two variables to stimulate the yeast to create enough carbon dioxide to properly rise the loaf. So I often tell people this bulk fermentation process is a little bit like making scrambled eggs, where everybody has a certain way that they like their scrambled eggs done, and it might take you 5 minutes, 6 minutes to get your eggs up to temperature, and then you get to that point where you have about a 30-second window to really get your eggs perfectly done, and if you stop too early, your eggs are going to be runny. If you stop too late, your eggs are going to be hard. That small window of when your eggs are done is very similar to what happens in bulk fermentation. If bulk fermentation takes, say, 5 hours, you might have a 30-minute window that you're dealing with, plus or minus that 5-hour mark, where you really catch your loaf at the perfect point where it's really perfectly proofed. Anything prior to that will be underproofed. Anything post that will start to be overproofed. So how do you read the crumb of a sourdough loaf? There are a lot of factors you can look at, but I really boiled it down to 3 things that you can look at to determine if a loaf is underproofed, nicely proofed, or overproofed. Here are the three factors. The first factor that we look at is the height and shape of the loaf. That will tell you a lot about whether the loaf is under or overproofed. The second thing that we look at is the distribution of holes in the crumb. So you want to step back and look at that profile of your crumb of the loaf and look at the constellation of holes in the crumb. That will tell you a lot about the proofing level of your loaf. The third thing that we look at is really zoom in and look closely at the types of holes in the crumb. That's the third criteria. Now let's talk about what you look for in each one of those areas. The first thing is when we look at the loaf height and shape. If your loaf is flat or pyramidal in shape, or sometimes it has a triangular type of top, that typically means it's underproofed. If your loaf is tall and rounded with nice rounded shoulders, that typically means it's nicely proofed. And if your loaf is flat, that can mean that it's overproofed. You can see here that flat could either be underproofed or overproofed, so we need to have more criteria. The second criteria we look at, the distribution of holes in the crumb. This is where you want to step back and look at that profile of the crumb and look at the constellation of all the holes in the crumb. And what you'll see are some patterns. If you see a pattern where you have a lot of dense holes at the bottom and large holes at the top, that typically means that your loaf is underproofed. If you have evenly distributed holes from top to bottom and edge to edge, that typically means you have a nicely proofed loaf. And if you have a lot of dense holes, really medium to small holes throughout the whole loaf, and you're starting to see a separation of the crust and crumb, that typically means the loaf is overproofed. The next thing we look at is that zoom in and really look at the type of holes in the crumb. If you have a lot of small pinpoint type holes and then some big tunnels in the crumb, and if the crumb is spongy and gummy, that usually means it's underproofed. And when I say spongy, I really mean that. Sometimes it actually looks like a kitchen sponge if you look at it. Then if you look at the crumb and it's a consistent distribution of small, medium, and large holes throughout the crumb, top to bottom, edge to edge, and the edge of the holes are a thin, lacy membrane, not gummy at all, that's an indication of a nicely proofed loaf. And then for overproofed loaves, you'll always see smaller, irregular shaped holes. These won't usually be round. They'll have ragged edges, they'll be flat, they'll be geometric, because the loaf is essentially starting to collapse. And you'll see that in the crumb. You'll see these ragged edges on the holes, and that crumb will typically be gummy and it might look a little bit gelatinized. Now let's look at underproofed and overproofed side by side, because these loaves can look very similar. So you have to often make this call. Underproofed on the left, see that dense crumb, and again it looks like a kitchen sponge. Those little pinpoint, very small holes, they tend to be more round holes in those dense areas of the crumb. On the right hand side, you can see that loaf actually inflated and now it's deflating. Those holes are collapsing. They have ragged edges, they have irregular shape, they're more flat than round, and the dough is starting to get really gummy with those ragged edges. That's the quick tutorial on the three criteria. Now let's go through some examples where I can really show you how this process works. So now I'll show you what I would call the classic examples of underproofed, nicely proofed, and overproofed loaves, and I'll explain the process I went through to determine that. So number one, this is what I would call a significantly underproofed loaf. What do I see here? It's a flat loaf. You can see that flat shape. The second thing I see is the tunneling at the top. That is a telltale sign of underproofing. Then if you look at the bottom of the loaf, you see the dense holes all the way across the bottom. So it's this combination of tunnels at the top and density at the bottom. And if you look closely at the crumb, you see that dense, gummy crumb that looks like a kitchen sponge. The second loaf is a slightly underproofed loaf. Now we got a little more height out of this loaf. You can see here it actually has a nice ear, it has decent height. So when this comes out of the oven, this is the type of loaf that I call false hope, where this actually looks pretty good on the outside. Then you cut it open and what do you see? The first thing is that pyramidal triangular shape. The second thing is the reason that that's a pyramidal triangular shape is because of that giant tunnel at the top. That's what'll give you that false rise where you think this is going to be a great loaf. That's really just under fermented dough from when it went into the oven. It opened up that big gas bubble. I have my density at the bottom, so the combination of dense bottom, holes at the top. And then if I zoom in, this is still a pretty dense crumb as I zoom in here. The third example, this is what I would call a nicely proofed loaf. You can already see the difference here in the shape. This has that classic rabbit ear shape. It has a nice ear. This has tall shoulders on both sides, so that shape of the loaf, tall and airy. You can immediately tell when it comes out of the oven. The second thing is that when I look at that profile of the crumb, I see this even, consistent distribution of small, medium, and large holes throughout the loaf. Then this is really what you want to look for to determine if the loaf is fully proofed. You want to see, is it proofed edge to edge and top to bottom? And what I'm looking for is density in any of those areas. I don't see any dense crumb at the top, bottom, left, or right side. That's really a fully proofed edge to edge loaf. And then lastly, I just double check at the bottom to make sure that I don't have that dense strip at the bottom. I do not. That's a really nicely proofed loaf at the bottom. That's a nice loaf. Now we move into slight overproofing. You can already see here I've lost some height. The first thing I see is the loaf is flattening. So this is not as tall as either of the prior two loaves. So I've gone past that peak point, and now the loaf is collapsing under its own weight because the gluten is breaking down. The second thing that I see is this irregular distribution of small, medium, and large holes. If I look at the crumb, it's kind of all over the place. There's a lot going on in here, and you can tell that it's just lost the uniformity of that previous loaf that was nicely proofed. Now I also start to see some density occurring at the bottom again because these overproofed loaves, as I said, start to collapse under their own weight as the gluten breaks down. And the other telltale sign of overproofing, which we didn't see in any of the prior two loaves, is this separation of the crust and crumb. The crust will become very thin, and you'll actually see the crumb pull back and start to separate from the crust. That's an indication of overproofing. Lastly, significantly overproofed loaf. This is a completely flat loaf. You can see I've lost my shape. This kind of looks like the shape of a shoe. I look at my crumb, and now I'm seeing mostly small holes with these ragged edges. So I've lost my height, I've lost the airiness. This is really a collapsing loaf. I look at the bottom, and I'm starting to see this strip of dense crumb at the bottom because all that weight is pushing down on the loaf. And then I see this telltale sign of overproofing, the thinning crust and ragged edges. When I say ragged edges, I mean look at that upper left of the loaf. You can see it's just a ragged mess on the scoring there, and on the lower right, that thinning crust where the crumb is pulling away from the crust. So those are what I would call the classic examples of the continuum of underproofing to overproofing. So now I'm going to take you on a tour across 18 loaves. Now these are in order from underproofing to overproofing, so you can see the transition that these loaves go through. We'll start in the foothills of despair with some badly underproofed loaves. We'll rise up to the plateau of some nicely proofed loaves, and then we'll end up in the valley of disappointment with some sadly overproofed loaves. Number one, this is a sadly underproofed and underbaked loaf. You see that dense crumb in the middle, completely flat loaf. I would call this sadly underproofed. Number two, this loaf is still underproofed, but it's starting to get that triangular pyramidal shape, so it's not completely flat, but I'm seeing the tunnels at the top, the density at the bottom. This is classic underproofing. If you have a weak starter or an immature starter, you'll create a lot of loaves like this. Number three, this is improving more. You can see I'm getting more height here, but now I'm getting those giant tunnels at the top that give me these loaves I call false hope, where this looks pretty good coming out of the oven, but I have this huge gas bubble inside due to under-fermented dough going into the oven. This is what I call underproofed with tunneling. Now this one still looked pretty good coming out of the oven, but I have these huge caverns in here, still underproofed, and look at that dense strip at the bottom. That's the telltale sign of underproofed dough, is that dense strip all across the bottom. This one I would call underproofed with caverns. Moving on, getting a little bit better. I got some really good height out of this loaf. This was actually the first loaf that I ever baked using the tartine method. I was really optimistic until I cut into it. This is still improving. I'm getting a little bit better proofing here, but I still have the giant caverns from underproofing. This is your underproofed pyramid. Now we're getting closer where I've lost the pyramid. I'm getting some rounded shoulders here, but I still have a really dense crumb, particularly on the left-hand side there. You can see that density that looks like a kitchen sponge. This is slightly underproofed still. Moving on, it's opening up a little bit more. This is still slightly underproofed because I still have the tunneling. I am getting better proofing edge to edge. You can see that I don't have that dense strip at the bottom, but I still have these tunnels penetrating through the loaf. This is still slightly underproofed. Then we move on to our first loaf, where I would call this nicely proofed. Beautiful shape, tall shoulders, I got the ear, and I look edge to edge, and I really don't see any dense crumb, top or bottom or edge to edge. I would call that a nicely proofed loaf. Moving on, here's another nicely proofed loaf. You get those tall shoulders, that consistent distribution of small, medium, and large holes, edge to edge, top to bottom. There's a little bit of density in the upper right there. That's really just from the shaping of the loaf. That's where the loaf kind of rolled up on itself, but that's still a nicely proofed loaf. This is another nicely proofed loaf that's now starting to open up. Now, one of the things that's been popularized with artisan sourdough bread baking and was really popularized with the tartine bread book is this idea of an open, irregular crumb. So rather than a real uniform distribution of holes, open irregular is a little bit more of the tartine style. This is really a classic open irregular crumb where I have some large holes here, but these are not the tunnels that I saw in those prior ones. This is just really good gluten development that I'm letting open up more. So this is what I would call open irregular. This is another style of open irregular crumb here, where this is beautifully proofed edge to edge, and you see small, medium, and large holes throughout. It just has more large holes than small and medium. This is what is often called a molten crumb. That's a nicely proofed loaf. Then we move on to this one. This is really crazy, and this is what some people would call a wild open crumb. You can sometimes get this when you let a loaf do a countertop proof after bulk fermentation and then put it into the refrigerator for a cold retard. That loaf will really open up and stretch out the gluten strands. Some people find this desirable. This is what I'd call wild open crumb. And then the next one, this is another wild open crumb, but a little bit less wild. This is a little milder version of it, not quite as crazy, but you see that gluten, you really let the gluten strands really stretch out on these loaves and open up on the inside. Then we move past the open crumb, and here you can see I really don't have any large holes in this loaf now. This is all medium to small. So this is what I'd call a fully proofed loaf. This is really desirable. Some people really love this style of loaf, and if you don't like your jam or butter dripping through the holes in your loaf, a lot of people will push to this level, which I would call fully proofed. Now here's another fully proofed loaf, but what's happening here is I'm starting to lose some height. You can see this loaf is flattening out a little bit. I'm starting to get that thinning of the crust and crumb on the edges. So this is what I'd call fully proofed plus. Still a really nice, desirable crumb, but moving past the tall open crumb. Now this is another slightly overproofed loaf because I've lost the ear, I've lost the height of this loaf. This loaf is starting to collapse a little bit under its own weight. It's still a beautifully proofed crumb, but the loaf is losing structure. So I would call this slightly overproofed. You won't get an ear on this loaf, you won't get tall shoulders on this. This is really past that optimal point, even though the crumb is still very nice. Now this one is interesting because some people might look at this and wonder if this is underproofed, but it's not because I look edge to edge, and you can see that it's proofed all the way to the top and bottom and side to side. There's no density of this crumb, but it's all small holes. I have ragged edges. They've lost the roundness of the holes, and the loaf is starting to flatten. This is a slightly overproofed loaf. That's a really good example of slight overproofing. Now we turn the corner, and this is really an overproofed loaf. It's lost its height. You see that ragged tearing on the top where the scoring was. You see a very irregular distribution of holes in the crumb, and that separation and thinning of the crust and crumb on the left. Classic overproofing. And lastly, this is a very overproofed loaf here. You see that gummy, dense crumb, those holes that look like soap suds, as I described earlier, the separation of crust and crumb, and the density at the bottom of the loaf because it's collapsing under its own weight. So all the differences that you just saw in the crumb photos were largely due to differences in bulk fermentation. The way that you bulk ferment your loaf produces the crumb. There are a lot of other small variables around the edges, but I've held all those constant. I use the same recipe. I did all the shaping the same way on these loaves. I bake them in the same oven the same way. So really what you're seeing there is the impact that bulk fermentation has on the crumb of a sourdough loaf. So then you're probably saying to yourself, wow, it would be cool if somebody made a video where they actually held all the variables constant and changed one thing at a time and then showed the impact on the crumb. Well, you came to the right place, because that's what I started doing 2 years ago, and I actually have 20 videos out there that show exactly that. So these are some examples of what you can see in the videos that I've already created. I look at the impact of 30-minute changes in bulk fermentation time across 4 different loaves of bread. I cut them open and assess the crumb. I do the same thing with 45-minute differences in bulk fermentation time. I bulk ferment at different temperatures from 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 degrees Celsius up to 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 32 degrees Celsius, and look at what impact that has on the crumb. I've had videos that I've made looking at different countertop proofing duration, different cold proofing in the refrigerator from 1 day to 5 days. I've changed the starter and leaven percentages to see what impact that has on the crumb. I've used an immature starter to demonstrate what that does to a crumb. I've changed pre-shaping methods, final shaping methods, bulk fermentation methods. I've used weak starter versus strong starter. I've done fermentation at very low temperatures, and in some videos I've actually combined multiple variables to show the impact of that and more. So if you really want to learn about how bulk fermentation impacts the crumb of a sourdough loaf, you are in the right place. Check out these other videos. Now, all the videos that I'm referencing here are included in the description of this video. You can click on that for all the details. Now you might be saying to yourself, this is a great video, but I wish I had a printout of all this so that when I'm in my kitchen cutting open my loaf and I see my crumb and I want to figure out if it's overproofed or underproofed, I don't want to have to go back and watch the video. You came to the right place for that as well. I've created the How to Read a Sourdough Crumb guide, which you can print out. The link is in the description of this video, so you can keep that in your kitchen with you. It has all the photos in there, all the criteria described, so you can go back and look at the photos when you're assessing your own crumb to determine if it's over or underproofed. So now I've created all these great tools, the video and the guide, to help you figure out how to read the sourdough crumb. Reading it is only part of solving the problem. Now you have to actually figure out how to fix it. As I mentioned, the way that you fix a lot of these problems is by finding that perfect cutoff point for bulk fermentation. So you're asking yourself the question, wow, I wish there was some kind of tool to help me figure out when bulk fermentation is done. I got that too. It's called the BULK-O-MATIC system. I have 8 videos that I created on this. It's basically a 9 criteria test where you can go through and ask 9 questions and determine when your bulk fermentation is at the optimal point. You can watch those videos, or you can print out the handy guide, because I also created one of those for you as well. The BULK-O-MATIC guide is also available in the link in the description of this video. Thank you for selecting this video. I hope you found it helpful. If you're not a subscriber to my YouTube channel, please click the subscribe button so you'll see new videos when I publish them. And if you enjoyed this video, please tell your friends about it. And lastly, good luck on your sourdough journey.